Thanks everyone for joining us to talk about the pathway to clean energy innovation. We'll be talking about our regulatory engagement and how we can get new projects through and how we can continue building a clean energy economy. And why EcoEngineers? Why are we here today? I think a lot of people hear about us in the audit world from the Renewable Fuel Standard or the Low Carbon Fuel Standard as a QAP provider, as an accredited lead verification body. But really today we'll be focusing on, the consulting side of our business. How do we work with renewable energy producers to gain access to these markets? We've done more than 90 regulatory engagement projects since 2010, since we started over 10 years ago now. We've also done a lot of carbon intensity analysis for preliminary projects before they come online. We're excited to see, many projects are taking this route of trying to do more due diligence before they come about and working through that process. We also do a lot of eco-university workshops, training and education, over 400 hours of that. And maybe I'm biased, I do lead that line, I do lead that team, but I do think that, we try to instill a strong base of education when working with our clients and ensuring that everyone has a strong base of knowledge when they're working through these regulations and to get market access. And this is us. This is everyone who will be participating today. My name is Natasha Bilstein. I am a senior regulatory consultant and the team lead for EcoUniversity, as I mentioned. We have Karen Jones, who's also a senior regulatory consultant. She's been at EcoEngineers for over 8 years now and has been representing our clients in rulemaking since 2012. And she's our subject matter expert on the RFS. She is our go-to person in-house when we think RFS here. And she's also the team lead for regulatory engagement. We also have Roxby, who's a senior regulatory consultant who just joined us from California. He's still there, lucky him, nice weather. And he's a subject matter expert in the LCFS, and his experience includes managing a biodiesel plant, a former board member of CARB, and the Low Carbon Fuel Coalition. He also has a PhD in geophysics from Oxford, which is very exciting. And Roxby is our biodiesel and renewable diesel line of business manager, as well as our compliance management team lead. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Karen.
Great, thanks so much, Natasha. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Roxby and I are really excited to be speaking with you today. We work really closely together on the regulatory engagement projects here at EcoEngineers. And that's really the focus of today, is sharing our lessons learned, our best practices, and our process for when we work with clients who come to us with innovative biofuel projects who really want to push the envelope and do something new and special to contributing to the clean energy economy. But oftentimes they can face regulatory hurdles through that process. And so that's why we're here to make that a little bit easier and to kind of guide the way as you navigate those waters. So with that, today's viewpoint is really kind of a little bit different look for us. We're going to present both the federal renewable fuel standard requirements and low carbon fuel standard requirements side by side. Our clients often come to us wanting to participate in both programs in order to see the most value for their investment for their biofuel project. And while the programs have a lot of similarities, there are also a lot of really key differences as well. And that's reflected in the pathway acceptance process on the front end. So we're going to be looking through the lens of really all biofuel types, whether you're a liquid fuel, whether you're renewable natural gas, or maybe like a low carbon intensity petroleum, really any fuel that can participate in these programs. We're looking at that high level lens through both programs side by side. So with that in mind, I'm going to be representing the RFS side of things. And the RFS, just very quickly, is the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard. This is associated with the RIN energy credit. And the overall program goal for the renewable fuel standard is to increase biofuel production in the US and biofuel use in our transportation fuel supply.
Hi everybody, thank you Karen. So I'm going to be talking on the LCFS side, and if you didn't know, the LCFS is California Air Resources Board flagship program for reducing the energy intensity of fuels. And both programs do one thing very well, and both of them drive innovation into the fuels. So why do they drive innovation? Well, a good example, I think, is in California. There might be a limited demand for various reasons. Maybe it's mandated, maybe there is restrictions in infrastructure. And then if you're shipping to California, you are actually competing with other low carbon fuels in the same bucket. And you might find that there's competition for the feedstock. You might be driving innovation in reducing the CI of your feedstock. And both programs, well, certainly the CARB program is trying to reduce the CI to under 20% by 20% by 2030. Karen, would you like to talk about innovation examples?
Sure. So, when we talk about innovation, what kinds of biofuel projects do we really mean? And we've seen so many great ideas out there of people, again, who are trying to trailblaze, create new fuels that can contribute to these programs and the program goals. So that includes making, a low carbon fuel plant more efficient. I think a good example of that is corn kernel fiber ethanol technology, where they're taking the same corn coming in, but they're making a lot more fuel and even cellulosic ethanol fuel out of that same volume of corn. Or you could be creating a new additive or a drop-in diesel replacement using a low carbon feedstock. You could be seeking out brand new feedstocks that are either a waste or a crop base that have a lower CI. Or maybe you're even seeking out different distribution channels. We've seen a lot in renewable natural gas projects where they're thinking about, maybe trucking the RNG from the source to the pipeline interconnect, and kind of changing up how that fuel is transferred and distributed. So all of those would be good examples of clean energy innovation. And what we found certainly throughout these projects, the bottom line is investment to get your project started requires regulatory certainty. These credits, both RINs and LCFS credits, can add significant financial revenue to your bottom line and are essential to predicting what the financial stability of the project will be once it's operational. So I have the table to the right is showing, the value of dairy renewable natural gas. And you can see the value of the actual commodity is quite small in comparison to the value of the RIN credit and of the LCFS credit. And we get these following common questions of our clients coming to us as they're looking through their financial analysis. They ask us, hey, will my project qualify for these RINs and or the LCFS credits? How much energy credit revenue should I include in my financial analysis? In this example, right, we have, $82 is the total. How do we, know that's the right amount to associate with the financial projection of my project? And then also, what's the timeline? How soon can I expect to generate revenues? And those are all great critical questions, but the fundamental question that I come back with is, how much certainty do you have in the answers, and that do you need to have in the answers to those questions to satisfy your investors, and so that you're able to go forward with business decisions. So, at ECO, we really want to support innovative project development, and we want to see these projects get started off in a good way. And at the 8 years I've been at EcoEngineers working with different projects, I've just seen too many that, you know, are either delayed or don't move forward at all, due in part to kind of underestimating regulatory risk and not putting enough time and effort on the front end of the project into due diligence. And so, you know, I'm always encouraging my clients to spend a lot of time and investment on the front end to really understand this.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. When Karen talks about regulatory risk, it isn't exactly the classic regulatory risk where the regulations are going to change. It's about how does your project fit into the current regulations. And you might think you've got a very clear pathway to the finish, that it might just be a 100-meter dash. It's going to be easy, you can see the finish line. But actually, there are likely to be at least a few hurdles in the way. And in the worst, it could be a steeplechase with water hazards and potential to trip up at every step. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about how to assess your regulatory risk. How well do you fit in the current regulations? What is the risk to your project? And we're going to talk about how you get your new ideas, your innovative ideas accepted into the RFS and the LCFS. And we're going to talk about how that, if it doesn't fit, what can you do about it? How can you actually change the regulation to make it fit? And then we're going to answer your questions at the end of the session.
All right, let's get started with assessing regulatory risk. And again, I just want to mention these lessons learned is really just based on our experience here at EcoEngineers and working closely with our clients. And we're really excited to be able to share with you here today. So the first question that I always ask, if anyone who comes to me with an innovative idea and is asking whether or not my project fits into the regulation, I always ask back, what is your risk tolerance? How much certainty do you require on the front end of your project to secure investment? How much certainty do you require that your project does meet the requirements for RINs and LCFS? And I see varying levels of risk tolerance out there. Of course, everyone comes to me and they say, of course, I want the highest certainty possible. Give me I have the lowest risk tolerance, and I want the most certainty when I'm making my investments to actually build a biofuel plant. I want to know for sure that it's going to qualify for RINs and LCFS. So this could mean seeking out written support from the regulatory agency of your project acceptance and qualification, and understanding that, hey, maybe there's other projects that are very similar that have already been approved by the regulators. That's usually a good test to see, you know, what's the risk of my project not qualifying. If there are other similar projects that have qualified, then you've probably passed that bar. That's a pretty high bar. However, written support and getting this kind of high certainty is quite difficult in practice. So where I usually steer people towards is this kind of moderate certainty and risk level. And this is a little bit easier to obtain. So this would be verbal support from the regulatory agency that generally, yes, you know, we think that your project is fitting in with the regulations and should proceed normally. And you can also seek out a third-party opinion on whether or not, you know, if your pathway will be accepted, and a third-party opinion on what your carbon intensity value is expected to be under LCFS. So that is quite easy to achieve. And finally, you know what? If you don't need a lot of certainty in order to proceed, then maybe no regulatory engagement is necessary. I would certainly recommend this for biofuel projects that are a lot more standard, where there have been others in the past who have already been accepted and approved and move forward. That would mean, hey, you know what? We don't need to engage. We can just proceed normally. So the first step in the process, lacing up for this race, this regulatory race, here are some of the initial project intake questions that we ask our clients at EcoEngineers when we're doing regulatory engagement. So this is where we're going to kind of split up RFS and LCFS and show you kind of the different questions and nuances associated with those programs. And we're going to break it up by first, overall initial questions, and then by specific elements of the pathway, that being specific to your feedstock, your production process, and your fuel type, as those are all very important components of your fuel pathway under these programs. So under RFS, the two very fundamental questions that you should answer at first is, will the biofuel produced under your project be used as transportation fuel within the United States? If not, it's not going to qualify. And secondly, does your feedstock meet the definition of renewable biomass? If you are processing plastics or non-renewable biomass materials, it's not going to qualify, or that portion of your fuel will not qualify for the program. It's just not consistent with RFS program goals. The third question is, how close to commercialization is your project? So is your project in more of the idea phase, or is it further down the road? Do you have a pilot plant? Has there been design engineering or tests that have been performed on your feedstock, on your fuel? And the closer to commercialization your project is, the more attention it's going to be given from EPA. So that's always a critical question.
Right, and of course for us, we always want to know how soon a project is going to be brought to market. But in California, we also asked a very similar question, which is, will the fuel be used in California? Because the program applies to transportation fuels in California, and it has to be transportation. If it's going into a generator, then it won't get carbon credits through the LCFS. And then the other thing we really have to understand is what are the boundary conditions for the feedstock? Because when you're modeling life cycle analysis, you're modeling the carbon intensity. We have to know, is it regarded as a waste? Is it, will ILUC apply? Those boundary conditions can make a very big difference to the final CI and the final viability of the project. For instance, if a great example of that is dairy manure generating methane, and if you avoid methane emissions, then you're likely to get a very low CI because methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas. And the other final question is, do you have an idea of what the CI is going to be? And if yes, did you get a third party to do that? Did you get somebody who's got experience, who understands life cycle analysis to generate that CI for you?
And I think one of the final fundamental questions, and I think we'd like to launch a poll. So Natasha, if you could launch the poll for us. We want to know, what's your training and experience level with RFS and LCFS?
Right, and I think you can see that from that. Like at the beginner level is you're going out for a Sunday stroll, and then the Olympian level is the highest level, which means that you can easily make a 100-meter dash in under 10 seconds.
All right, giving everyone about 5 more seconds to respond. Okay, awesome. So you all should be able to see the results here. So we have 14% at beginner, 47% at amateur some knowledge, and then 37% at professional or substantial knowledge, and then 2% at Olympian level or expert knowledge. So, I think anywhere you're beginning is great, and we you know, our Eco-University workshops are actually a great opportunity to strengthen that knowledge. And I think one of the cool parts is we'll meet you where you are. You know, if you have, you know, maybe you're in the beginner level of knowledge, that's a-okay. We'll start from 101 and go from there. But if you are in the professional or Olympian level of knowledge, maybe you want to know more about life cycle analysis. Maybe you need, you know, more specific work with you on what you're looking for. We have modules and we'll work with you through that as well. So feel free to reach out to us if that is something that's interesting, and we'll talk more about that later if there's questions. Thanks, everyone. I'm gonna let them get back to the presentation.
Great. It's always great to see where people are at. All right, so next, let's talk about your innovative feedstock. So, you know, it's always important to understand, you know, what is the unique aspect to your creative project or idea? You know, is it the feedstock, is it the production process, or is it the fuel? Whatever is unique and different, let's focus on that and hone in on it. So if you have an innovative feedstock that's new, you know, does your feedstock have an approved pathway, or is it really similar to something that does have an approved pathway? And here you get into the nuance of some of the regulatory definitions. And you know, things that come to mind is especially around the woody biomass regulatory definitions. There are 3 woody biomass pathways under RFS. But when you get into the nuance of what those, you know, woody biomass residues actually mean under the program, you start to find that there may be differences between generally accepted forestry definitions and practices. So really got to get into the weeds on what EPA means when they say this type of feedstock. Also, is your feedstock a waste, or is it an agricultural crop? This is really important because identifying, you know, what the compliance documentation trail is needed for your project in the beginning stages, I think is really critical because, you know, agricultural crops, if they're grown outside of the US or Canada, require a lot of traceability documentation back to the farmland. And if that just isn't feasible to get, that could really influence your project and whether or not, you know, you move forward with it. So that's really important. And finally, too, if you're looking to get a D3 cellulosic RIN, which is the highest valued RIN, have you performed some formal compositional analysis on your cellulosic feedstock? We see this a lot, especially with renewable natural gas and people getting creative with what they're putting in the agricultural digesters, wanting to expand what's going into there. Does that actually meet the definition of a cellulosic feedstock? And EPA is really specific about what they mean when they say cellulosic.
Right, and for the LCFS, it's slightly different. I mean, the first thing you really have to think about is it a project-based idea you have where you are actually innovating with crude oil, or you are making your refining more efficient and you're going to claim carbon credits above a boundary which is the average benchmark for the diesel or the gasoline that's sold in California. And you don't get a lower CI diesel fuel if it's petroleum based. You end up with, you might end up just getting carbon credits from making your refining more efficient. If it's a biofuel, then you can apply for a pathway. And so that distinction is very important because the regulation is very different for those 2 different approaches. And then you can, with a feedstock, you can also, if you're a feedstock supplier, you can apply for a joint pathway with a fuel producer. And that means you end up with a CI fee for feedstock you're producing that can help you monetize what's your innovative idea.
Great. All right, what's next? Production processes. So if the unique part of your pathway is production, what questions should you be asking? Well, let's understand the details about your production process and how it is similar or different to a traditional biofuel production process. Again, the further it is from a process that EPA understands and that they have modeled, the more difficult the race is going to be for you. So the more similar it is, the more it's going to be a simple race. So that's important. And as well as, does your production process require, complex mass balance or compliance record keeping, production records or laboratory analysis? This gets into the importance of compliance documentation and understanding that at the beginning. And an example of this could be, let's say you're co-processing renewable and non-renewable feedstocks at one biofuel plant. Well, that's two different fuel streams coming out. There's a renewable fuel stream and a non-renewable fuel stream. How are you adequately, quantifying, how many RINs are generated from that fuel? And that often requires compliance systems and mass balance systems that should be in place. And these are all hurdles that you can cross, to be sure, but it's important to understand that, yes, indeed, this is going to be a hurdle, and that we should allocate time and resources to really thinking through how your plant is going to be set up, how it's going to be metering and monitoring the production process to make sure that you're going to have no problems with your compliance record keeping on the back end.
And the LCFS is rather different here. CARB has provided a number of tier 1 models, which are if your production process fits into one of those, then you've got pretty high certainty that you're going to get the CI score that you want. If it fits into a tier 2 model, then if it doesn't fit in with the standard production processes, then you have to go and model it. And that might be because of something you're doing in the plant, or it might be an innovative feedstock. And it just requires much more documentation to go ahead and do that. And we have to know, when we're modeling a feedstock, we have to understand the energy consumption and the transportation distances, all the energy that goes into making the feedstock, making the fuel, transporting it to the market. We have to understand all that. And the nice thing about the LCFS is it does allow mass and energy balancing between different feedstocks and streams at a plant. And now we've got through all that, we haven't even started the race yet. We're just about ready to go. So I'll hand it back to Karen.
All right, and finally, what if the unique part of your project is an innovative fuel? So you're making a new kind of fuel. This can be quite the hurdle. And certainly under RFS, I'm just going to bring up for liquid fuels in particular, have to undergo Part 79 registration and health effects testing for their fuel. And the fuel, let's say it's a, for example, drop-in diesel fuel. You need to have access to this health effects testing data specific to the feedstock that you're using and the production process to ensure that you're meeting all of the requirements. And getting access to this data, especially for renewable diesel projects, can be quite onerous and could stop you in your tracks. Again, these are all hurdles that you can cross and you can fly over, but for some projects, these can be quite onerous. So understanding this Part 79 versus Part 80 is going to be really important.
Yeah, and similarly for the LCFS, you have to make sure that the fuel isn't going to poison the atmosphere, and so there is testing to do, and they have a methodology where you can build up the degree of testing with small tests to start with, small amounts of fuel being sold, up to the point where you have to do the full multimedia testing. And of course, you have to make sure, a good measure is, does your fuel meet the ASTM standard? So that is like for biodiesel and for biodiesel blends and for diesel fuel, there are ASTM standards that allow you to know that your fuel will not poison the atmosphere. Of course, you have to be careful with that as well, because even though the standards might say, okay, yes, you're making, say, standard biodiesel, you might have to do more to make sure that you are not actually releasing any toxins into the air.
Great. So at the end, I do want to make sure that we understand that while this race, this process to program acceptance can be difficult, it can be frustrating sometimes for, especially with people who are trailblazers, and you're the first ones, doing this new thing for the first time, and sometimes it can feel, wow, like you're up against all of these hurdles. But keep in mind that, you are aligned with the regulators. The regulators are not your adversaries, and it's important to work with them, because essentially you have the same interest in mind, which is EPA and CARB. They need your innovative ideas, they need your innovative fuels to contribute and meet their program goals. They rely on it. They are assuming that, as this industry just grows, there's going to be new technologies coming out, and anything that can contribute to their program is important to them. So they are not your adversary. They are aligned with you. And it's important to keep in mind that, what if the opposite were true? What if the program had a very easy, a very weak approval process, and if projects accepted, what if they didn't contribute to program goals, or encouraged more air pollution, or resulted in fraud? Those would all be very negative, of course, negative things for the program.
Right, and the integrity of the program is really critical. And one thing I really like about both programs is that they're both data-driven. As a trained scientist, it's really nice to see what the models are, see the information that's gone into building them, and they're very intricate and well built. And the RFS, when you get a GHG reduction, you end up with into one of the RIN sections like D6 or D5. And for the LCFS, you actually end up with a score. And the score gives you a very clear idea of how many carbon credits you're going to generate. But there's one more thing to bear in mind, and this is critical, is that CARB and the RFS the staff are very busy. They have a lot of innovative ideas coming at them. And if your idea is going to generate a lot of low carbon fuels, then you're likely to see more attention given to you by the regulators.
Right. So just some final thoughts as we wrap up this section, and in our advice and opinion on this topic is that really at the end of the day, be thoughtful about how you approach EPA and CARB, about how much time you spend in assessing your regulatory risk and really understanding what those hurdles are going to be, so that you can think of ways to get beyond those hurdles. You can plan, and that really is going to set you up for success and set your project up to make sure that it's going to generate the revenue that you expect in the timeline that you expect. So our recommendation for success is, right, understand the regulatory risks specific to your project. This process, well, While we have general questions that apply to everyone, the approach and the strategy is always very project specific. So we spend a lot of time at EcoEngineers through our regulatory engagement line. We spend a lot of time with our clients just thinking through, what would be the right strategy, to go about talking and engaging with EPA and CARB on this. So it's important to hone your ask to EPA and CARB. And when I say ask, I mean, when you're actually talking with them, what are you presenting and what do you need in order to move forward and get to a go, no-go investment decision? And this goes back to understanding, hey, what's your risk tolerance? Do you need a written approval from them? Or is verbal okay? That's going to change the strategy. Develop a regulatory engagement strategy, including, hey, who am I going to meet with? Understanding what staff are in what roles and can provide what type of advice at both EPA and CARB is critical. We always recommend getting a third-party carbon intensity analysis, especially if you're going to participate in the low carbon fuel standard. It's helpful for EPA. It's helpful to understand what your greenhouse gas reduction is expected to be. But it's really important for LCFS and important for projecting your expected revenues from LCFS. And we always recommend education and training, empowering our clients to really understand, what are the compliance requirements of both programs? What are the nuances specific to my fuel type or pathway that I need to understand? So identifying areas of additional training is critical, and to do early and to do refreshers often, especially as you may hire more staff or you get further along in your project. And finally, it's always good to make friends and not adversaries in this industry. And there's a lot of key industry associations that you can align with that can help your cause. So I really recommend reaching out to, maybe your field type specific association, getting involved, seeing how they can help support you, as well as understanding who your local representatives are. If you need to go to a political level, having them understand, hey, in my state, this is going to contribute jobs. This is an important, project for our economy. Those are going to come handy in your back pocket, as well as, engaging with environmental groups and making sure that they're supportive. Because the more friends you have, especially if your project goes out for public comment, the less of a hurdle that will be. Hopefully, the less negative comments you will receive. And really, the easier it will be for the regulators to just say yes. And the more that you can, get to that point to make it easy on them, easy on their time, to just say yes to your project is important and critical. So with that, there's a few different ways, formal ways in which you can engage with the regulators. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on here. We're just going to touch on it. But please ask us questions or get in touch with Roxby and I if you want to know more about these processes. Again, the strategy is so project specific. So these are some general ways that you can start the engagement. But we really recommend project-specific strategy. So with that being said, on the RFS side, there is a pathway screening tool option. And you can go on the EPA website. They have a lot of information about the pathway screening tool and pathway petition process. And this is a very short form. What I really like about the PST is that you receive a written response from EPA typically within 30 to 60 days. So it's really nice to get a written response, and that response is either going to say, yes, you fit in with regulation, no, you don't, or you might, and we need more information. And usually the more information needed comes in the form of the full pathway petition. The full pathway petition, you're providing a lot of information, including mass and energy balance, a lot of detail about, again, what's unique about your project and your process, so that EPA can then go back and do their own modeling in-house based on the information that you've given them. The problems that I see with the PST process is that it's a very brief form, and the quality and scope of the response is directly proportional to the quality and scope of the information you put into that. And so sometimes, even though you may receive a written response, you know, I'm always wondering, okay, what questions did you ask? What information, project information did you put in? Because they're only responding to what information you put into that form. And also, too, it's not going to cover some of those compliance documentation requirements. That's a completely different team at EPA. And so if you know, we have found cases where, you know what, Pathways team says you're good to go, but then the compliance team is saying, you know, we need to put more thought into what your compliance documentation looks like. So anyways, those are some things to consider. You could always request a meeting with EPA. They're very, very busy. So, you know, getting on their schedule can be difficult at times, depending on what their current workload is.
And the LCFS is similar and different at the same time. We go through, when we do this regulatory engagement, it's very bespoke. One size doesn't fit all. So we go through the whole process, we engage with CARB, we are likely to have meetings with CARB, and then they might ask for a model, and that model could be goes as far as a design-based pathway, where you do a formal modeling process and then you send it to CARB, and CARB will review it and then put it up for public comment. And that is a great way to get certainty of your CI score, and that what you're doing is going to get accepted by CARB because it goes out for public comment. Of course, it's a two-edged sword, because if it goes out for public comment, pretty much everybody else is going to understand what you're doing, and they will see the CI score you're likely to achieve. And then slightly further down the road, when you're commissioning, you have to use a temporary pathway. Now, it could be that you fit into the lookup table, but you also might find that it might go to the lookup table, or you might find that you have to get a temporary pathway and apply to CARB and get an executive order for a temporary pathway. And of course, it doesn't hurt to have meetings with CARB and say, okay, this is what we're trying to do, and get their advice. And of course, the CARB might just turn around and say, no, it doesn't fit in the current regulation. But then there's a final option that you could take, and that is to actually go ahead and see if you can get the regulation changed. And
right.
That tees up for the rulemaking change process.
Thanks, Roxby. So just briefly on the RFS, RFS has a very standard proposed rulemaking, public comment period, and then final rulemaking process. You know, once things are final, they get published in the Federal Register. I will say, you know, at least for this year, when we're looking ahead, we were expecting the annual RVO for 2021 to come out, and I was expecting, usually EPA tacks on any program amendments to that RVO rulemaking. They certainly did that last year. But what I've heard recently is that is currently delayed due to this being an election year. So with that being in mind, you know, have no fear. EPA staff is still willing to work with project owners through existing regulation, and there's quite a lot that they can do as long as your project fits within, you know, the current regulatory language. And so I do recommend engaging with EPA in 2020 on your project and seeing if you can work through those channels to get your project approved. We'll see what happens next year with the election and see how that impacts EPA and their rulemaking process. But don't be afraid to engage with EPA this year.
The LCFS isn't a yearly process. They go through a 3-year rulemaking, and we're about a year and a half into this cycle. And the first 2 years are pretty much CARB finding ideas, talking to stakeholders, gathering information about the changes they'd like to make. And the 3rd year is comment period, analysis of the regulation before it gets finalized and comes and gets accepted and becomes effective on Jan 1st, 2022. And there are lots of options in there. And if you don't fit into the current regulation, you can approach CARB and say, can we do this? And see if it fits into the regulatory change they'd like to make. Now, the look back in 2019, there are lots of things went in. There's inclusion of jet fuel and propane. There's infrastructure credits, refinery investment credits. There's LCFS re-verification program, and there was the carbon capture sequestration protocol went in. So there was a lot that went in to 2019. I don't think 2022 is going to be quite as extensive. But things that might be going in are things like farm practices. There might be an expansion of carbon sequestration, perhaps utilization. There might be other refinery programs that people would like to see added. And perhaps your innovative pathway might be one that gets into the new regulation.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so we're really recommending, there will be workshops, probably remotely later this year, but ahead of those workshops, if you have a pathway that you'd like to engage with CARB on, they are available for meetings. This is the time. This is the time to get in front of CARB and to have some say and input into this rulemaking change. And so we're really recommending that you do that, and we hope that we can help. So feel free to contact myself and Roxby. We'd really love to work with you on your innovative project, understand the details of that project and develop a regulatory strategy for you. Just to close out, I just want to say too, our role and our focus, our strategy has been, and it's been quite effective, is, hey, to make a technical argument to the technical staff on, hey, let's get these innovative ideas through. And so we have a whole slew of technical staff, chemical engineers, life cycle analysts, we have subject matter experts like me and Roxby in the regulations. And so our team put together is really here to help your project and help consult with you as you move forward. So with that, I think we have a little bit of time left for your questions, and I'll just hand it over to Natasha.
Yeah, we have quite a bit of time for questions, and there's a lot of questions being asked. So thanks everyone for sending those in. Let's start with this one. Karen, you mentioned the 2021 RVO decision making has been delayed. Does that include decisions on your SREs in the January 10th Circuit Appellate Court decision?
Okay, not to get into too much detail, but so as far as what I understand is that typically the proposal for the 2021 RVO comes out in June of every year. Well, it's July now, and word on the street is that will be delayed till who knows when, likely after the election. So we won't even know what the proposed RVO is until much later. And of course, once the proposed RVO comes out, there's a public comment period, and then there's a final rulemaking. So that does take typically 6 months in between there. And so we're likely going to be well into 2021 before we know for sure what that RVO mandate is going to be. So I don't know exactly what's, whether or not EPA is going to cover SREs in that proposed rulemaking. That is yet to be seen.
Okay, another question on for CARB. So what are our thoughts on the probability of CARB approving a poultry farm RNG pathway? Roxby, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I haven't worked in that space as much as you, Natasha. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I think at a high level, I don't know that poultry litter can have, you could register a pathway with that. The only problem there is that you're not going to get the same level of avoided emission credit that you get for swine and dairy manure. And what we have been told is that it's because dairy and swine manure are directly in the regulation. It's not based off of manure management practices per se, but it's because it says dairy and swine manure in the regulation. Maybe that changes in the next rulemaking. That would be great. Maybe to see beef cattle potentially be considered and other feedstocks. But part of the I guess challenge with poultry manure and poultry litter is that this is very odd to talk about, but it's not liquid enough to create the necessary amount of anaerobic digestion. And generally speaking, it's already land applied, so there's already a use for it. But you could register the pathway into California. It just won't realize the same -200, -300 CI score. Let's see what else. What other questions are there? Does marine fuel qualify for the LCFS and RFS credits? Roxby, what about LCFS? I don't think marine fuel is an applicable use. Not yet. Karen, any thoughts on the RFS for that?
Right. So EPA has very specific definitions when it comes to marine fuel, and basically there are carve-outs for C1 engines, which are like very, very small engines, typically in coastal waters. Maybe they're ferries, very, very small boats. So otherwise marine fuel is not qualifying under the RFS program. And that would require a rulemaking change, pretty significant rulemaking change to include if you wanted like cruise ships or other industrial like tanker ships to be included.
I think it'd be analogous to jet as well, where you could opt in to get credits, but because it can, I think it's an interstate problem. But I'm a Brit. I'm not sure of the law as Americans, but I would say that you have to be careful when you're regulating things that go across state boundaries, and for the military as well. So all those areas you just have to be careful about.
Karen, do you anticipate there being any delay for project approvals for a typical feedstock? So say maybe like a landfill or something like that because of the 2021 RVO delay?
No.
Oh, perfect.
No,
Okay.
I think actually, in recent years, that's been one of the really positive things is that if you fit in clearly to a pathway, and if it's like a landfill RNG project, for example, the registration and approval process is incredibly quick. We submit a lot of RFS registration and engineering review reports to EPA, and we've gotten them approved in as little as 2 days.
Wow.
Which is just fantastic, especially compared to several years ago. Gosh, it would take 6 months to a year to 2 years to get those projects approved. So if you fit into the regulation, it's a very smooth process.
So no one be afraid if you're already in the regulation, don't be afraid of that. So there was one question, I believe it was on the slide where we were talking about, there's a table to the right where it had RNG prices, where we talked about the stacking. And there was a question about the value what is the value per measurement in this slide? And my best guess is, and if the asker of the question wants to clarify, please do, but my guess was that they were asking about the unit, and it was in MMBTU. So just want to make that clarification before we got too far along the way. Let's see, Roxby, there's a good question here about electricity in California. So you mentioned that low carbon fuel does not, that if low carbon fuel does not go to electricity, it does not qualify for the LCFS in California. What about the
that depends. If it's going to fuel a vehicle, then it does. I was thinking, say, if you've got a generator that's off-site at a quarry, something that's off-road, or say going into an agricultural pump, and it's not going into transportation fuel pool. But if the end result is that it's going into transportation, then yes, it can qualify. And if you're using RNG, you can get very low CI because of the energy efficiency ratio of electric engines.
Right, and you can actually even bring in electricity from projects that are located within the WEC region. So you can utilize the similar idea for book and claim low CI electricity that you do for book and claim biomethane in the LCFS regulation, except for the main difference, which is an important distinction, is that it has to be the actual electrons that travel into the electric grid. Good question. Let's see. There's a question about plastic. So is the LCFS similar to the RFS? Is it similar to the RFS in that, I lost my question. Okay, sorry about that. Is LCFS similar to the RFS in that plastics are not a viable feedstock? Roxby, any thoughts on that?
I don't think there are any pathways using plastic as a feedstock, but I don't think we've actually seen anybody try. So we don't know. I mean, that's a very good question, and if you want us to find out, then you should come and talk to us.
I think that sounds like that's really the kind of question that the design-based process was designed to address and bring forth and have an analysis done of these potential feedstocks that and give them some analysis to back up the claims that they're making. And I think that's a really good potential for that process. One question here, and I think this is kind of across the regulations, how long does this process take from the time you start your pathway screening tool, from the time you have this idea for a new feedstock? How long does this process take?
Right. I'd say it's kind of hard to say because everything is so project specific, and it really depends on what is unique about your project and how unique it is. So one of the things we do here at EcoEngineers is we do provide a letter of opinion as a service. If you're looking for an overview of the regulations, an overview of what we think for your specific project the expected timeline will be, just to give you a sense, to give your investors a sense, that is the kind of analysis that we do. So it's not a quick process. So my recommendation is always to get started early. But again, and earlier, especially if you're doing something very, very new and different. If you're doing something that's just like a slight tweak, or you're just looking for maybe clarification on compliance documentation, I would start maybe 3 to 6 months ahead of your project commissioning, to work on that. But anything that's more substantial, at least a year or 2 years prior.
Right, and with that sort of project, it takes us even a long time for us to figure out the scope of work is and how much effort it's going to take on our part as well, because it could be complicated. We have to understand how it's going to fit into the regulation. There's a lot of thought has to go into how we design the regulatory approach.
Sorry, had to unmute myself. Didn't want to have any background noise. Let's see, any last thoughts from either one of you before we wrap this up? You know, I know there was a couple questions we didn't get to, but please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to answer those questions. Roxby and Karen, their inboxes are open and waiting for you all. If you do want to ask those questions over email, we're more than happy to make sure that you get the answers you're looking for. But any last thoughts here?
I would say remember that the regulators want to help you. Their goals are aligned with yours. They want to see more low carbon fuel come to market at every step of the process. So they really are, and they're very, very knowledgeable. It's always good to talk to them.
Anything from you, Karen?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your busy day to join us, and really hope that you valued your time spent with us. I hope that we made you think about something new, something you haven't thought about before. So please feel free to reach out to Roxby or myself. Again, we're excited to work with you on your projects and learn more.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.